Throughout the evening, I couldn't help but notice a pair of men lingering in a booth. One occasionally ventured to other tables while the other nursed his drink. Typically, he approached tables occupied by women, engaging in brief conversations. Sometimes these conversations ended swiftly, while other times he produced an envelope containing documents or pictures, the contents of which were unclear to me. I assumed they were engaged in sales, finding it surprising that the management hadn't intervened. Later that night, I mentioned this observation to my companions, my wife Christy, along with our friends Chris and his wife Liz, and Heinz and his wife Kim. We briefly speculated about their activities before moving on. About 30 minutes later, the first man finally approached our table. I presumed he had exhausted his options with tables occupied predominantly by women, and we were about to learn what was going on. He greeted us, asking how we were all doing tonight, his tone friendly. Our responses were muddled, and he smiled at each of us before continuing. He explained that his friend, who was in town for the weekend on business, was looking for some company. He wanted to see if any of the ladies might be interested. I was taken aback by his audacity to approach a table where each woman was clearly accompanied by her partner and ask if they'd be interested in accompanying his friend for lovemaking. I was about to express my thoughts when Liz spoke up, questioning his proposition. The man responded, explaining that his friend was well endowed and knew how to use it, suggesting that one of us might be interested in giving it a try. At this point, the women were barely holding back laughter, but he seemed oblivious, perhaps repeated rejection had made him immune. Kim took the next step, likely sparking the events that followed. "And how do we know he's really that well equipped?" she asked. The man retrieved the familiar envelope he had been carrying all evening, revealing several pictures of his friend, confirming his claim. At this juncture, the men among us were content to let the women handle the situation, eagerly anticipating the moment this individual would be sent away. The women, visibly impressed by the pictures, reacted with exaggerated enthusiasm, while Chris, Heinz, and I observed with amusement at their antics. Then came the pivotal moment, the big proposition. "So, ladies, what do you say? Any takers?" The man's inquiry hung in the air as Liz and Kim shook their heads, giggling, before returning the pictures to him, neatly stowed back in the envelope. It appeared he was ready to move on, perhaps to try his luck elsewhere. Yet, he paused, his gaze settling on Christy. There was a flicker of recognition in his eyes, or so it seemed, as he directed the question at her once more, "And you, little lady? What about you?" I sat there, outwardly composed but inwardly fraught with anticipation, awaiting Christy's response. When she finally spoke, I found myself more focused on the man's reaction than on her words. To my astonishment, instead of disappointment or composure, he broke into a wide grin and sauntered over to Christy. It took me a moment to process her agreement, "I'll go." By the time I regained my composure, he had whisked her away from the table, leading her toward the exit. It was unclear whether there was a signal or if the other man simply understood, but he too began heading for the door. Our friends were as stunned as I was, attempting to voice their concerns to Christy, yet no words escaped their lips. Despite my shock, I acted swiftly, grabbing Christy's arm and pulling her away from him before they reached the exit. I questioned the bouncer's actions, demanding to know what he thought he was doing. However, my protests were cut short as a massive hand, attached to the largest arm I'd ever seen, seized mine, forcing me to release Christy. I pleaded with the bouncer, emphasizing that Christy was my wife and that I was merely trying to prevent her from leaving with those men. Despite my protests, he maintained his grip, asserting his authority over the situation. He expressed regret for whatever turmoil was unfolding in my marriage, yet firmly cited his obligation to prevent violence. According to him, since Christy claimed she was leaving willingly, he couldn't allow me to touch her on their property. Even as he held me in place, Christy leaned in and whispered something in the bouncer's ear. His expression shifted, giving her a curious look before glancing back at me and then at her again. He inquired about Christy's certainty in her choice. Chris glanced at me, then seemed to muster her determination, confirming her decision to the bouncer with newfound assurance. Afterward, Chris strode toward the waiting men by the door. Despite my desperate pleas for her to reconsider and return, she proceeded without hesitation. Helplessly, I watched as she joined the two men and departed through the doorway. Assuming the bouncer would release me after their departure, granting me the opportunity to pursue them, I attempted to break free. However, I found myself still firmly restrained even after the door closed. Puzzled, I questioned the bouncer's continued hold on me since they were no longer on the premises. My struggles proved futile, and eventually, I ceased, resigned to the situation. The bouncer explained that Christ had requested he detain me a few minutes longer to prevent my pursuit, citing the technicality that the parking lot remained their property. Realizing Christie's voluntary departure with the two men and her request to detain me drained me of any remaining resistance. Meanwhile, our friends stood nearby, stunned by the unfolding events. Upon the bouncer's eventual release of my arm, I collapsed to the floor, overwhelmed with defeat. As the tension subsided, the bar gradually resumed its peripheral conversations, leaving me to sit in despair, tears silently streaming down my face. The painful realization that Christ had chosen to leave despite my presence left me grappling with feelings of inadequacy and betrayal. Yet, amidst the turmoil, a sense of determination emerged. With assistance from Chris and Hines, I regained my footing and returned to our table, where Kim and Liz offered consolation. However, upon noticing Christie's vacant seat, a resolute resolve overcame me. Leaving a sum of $140 on the table, I made my way toward the exit. While Kim queried my departure, I asserted that lingering held no purpose and that I had pressing matters to attend to. Liz suggested awaiting Christie's return, but I dismissed the notion, proposing they provide her with shelter for the night instead. Determined to confront the situation head-on, I departed the bar, steeling myself against the pervasive sense of pity from onlookers. Upon reaching my car, emotions overwhelmed me once more, leaving me feeling dizzy and on the brink of collapse. I remained seated in the driver's seat, grappling with the whirlwind of thoughts and emotions that consumed me. Feeling composed enough to drive myself home, I couldn't help but reflect on the bitter irony that Christie's impulsive nature, which had once drawn me to her, was now the source of our unraveling. As I navigated the familiar streets back to our apartment, my mind wrestled with a myriad of emotions, ranging from disbelief to anger to profound sadness. About halfway through the journey, my phone flashed with Christie's number on the caller ID. An instinctive pang of hope surged within me, perhaps a naive expectation that she had a change of heart and was reaching out for reassurance or guidance. Without hesitation, I answered the call, my voice devoid of pleasantries, already poised to offer her the support she might need. However, my hopes were quickly dashed as Christie's voice filtered through the line. There was a strained quality to her tone, a sense of urgency mixed with a hint of reluctance. As she spoke, it became apparent that this call wasn't about seeking solace or reconsideration. Instead, it was an uncomfortable exchange where she danced around the truth, evading direct questions about her whereabouts and intentions. Navigating through this conversation felt like tiptoeing through a minefield of emotions. With each carefully chosen word, Chris seemed to be building up to a revelation, one that I dreaded yet anticipated with a sinking heart. And then it came, her admission that she wasn't alone, that she had chosen to be with someone else. The words hit me like a sledgehammer, leaving me reeling with disbelief and hurt. How could she do this? How could she betray our bonds so callously? In that moment, any semblance of composure I had mustered shattered into 1,000 pieces, replaced by a tumultuous whirlwind of emotions, anger, sadness, and a profound sense of betrayal. Despite the turmoil raging within me, I found myself engaging in a surreal exchange with Christ, where I feigned acceptance and understanding, masking the turmoil churning beneath the surface. It was a performance born out of necessity, a desperate attempt to shield myself from the raw pain of her betrayal. As the call drew to a close, I was left grappling with a profound sense of loss and disillusionment. The woman I loved had chosen someone else, leaving me to pick up the shattered pieces of our shattered relationship. In that moment, as I stared blankly at the illuminated screen of my phone, I knew that nothing would ever be the same again. As Chris entered the bedroom, seemingly oblivious to the tension thickening the air, I couldn't help but let out a sarcastic wish for her to have a good time. However, my attempt at conveying my true feelings was lost on her, as she responded as if returning from a casual gathering. Glancing at her, it was evident that her hair was disheveled, makeup smeared, and her clothes rumpled, all telltale signs of an eventful evening. Her initial facade of satisfaction quickly evaporated as her eyes fell upon me packing my belongings. With an air of desperation, she questioned my actions, attempting to reach out and stop my frenzied packing. Yet, I was quick to brush her hand away, a surge of anger akin to the grip of the bouncer on my arm coursing through me. Firmly, I warned her against touching me, conveying my understanding that her decision to indulge with those men was made regardless of its repercussions. In a feeble attempt to dissuade me, she pleaded with me not to leave, justifying her actions with flimsy excuses about not wanting to leave Desmond hanging after his efforts. She attempted to assure me that it was merely a one-time occurrence, and pledged eternal fidelity, promising to do anything to make amends. Despite my deep disappointment and the shattering of the vows we once exchanged with such sincerity, I reluctantly entertained the possibility of reconciliation. However, I made it clear that my willingness to even consider it hinged on her divulging the details of the hotel and room where they had taken her. Yet, Chris remained stubbornly defiant, adamantly refusing to disclose any information, dismissing my request with a callous remark. She expressed concern about my well-being, fearing that my anger might lead to reckless actions. But I refused to yield, asserting my autonomy and the right to make my own decisions in the face of such betrayal. In the tense atmosphere of our confrontation, as I pressed for the whereabouts of the hotel and room, it felt like the very fabric of our relationship was unraveling before my eyes. Chris, initially defiant, eventually relented under the weight of my persistence, her demeanor shifting from defiance to resignation. It was a moment pregnant with emotion, heavy with the realization of the irreparable damage inflicted upon our bond. As I methodically continued packing my belongings, Christie's feeble attempts to persuade me to stay felt hollow and inadequate, her assurances of love and remorse falling flat against the backdrop of her recent actions. The air crackled with unspoken words, each apology and declaration of affection rendered meaningless by the profound breach of trust that now loomed between us. Loading my suitcases into the car, each trip up and down the stairs seemed to echo the emotional turmoil churning within me. Leaving behind the woman I had once loved with all my heart was a decision I never thought I would have to make, yet here I was, faced with the painful reality of our fractured relationship. Returning to the apartment for the second time, the silence was deafening, a stark reminder of the void that had opened up between us. Seeing Chris collapsed on the floor, her tear-streaked face a poignant symbol of the devastation wrought by her actions, filled me with a profound sense of sorrow and loss. Waking up disoriented in the unfamiliar surroundings of the hotel room, the events of the previous night flooded back with crushing clarity. The exhaustion that washed over me was not just physical but emotional, a heavy burden that threatened to consume me. As I lay there grappling with the uncertainty of our future, a myriad of questions raced through my mind. How could we ever hope to rebuild what had been so callously torn asunder? Was there still a glimmer of hope amidst the ruins of our shattered relationship, or were we destined to remain forever adrift in a sea of regret and resentment? The answers eluded me, lost in the vast expanse of uncertainty that stretched out before me. All I knew was that the road ahead would be fraught with challenges, a daunting journey into the unknown. But amidst the darkness, perhaps there still lay the faintest glimmer of hope, a tiny beacon of light to guide us through the darkness. Amidst the swirling tempest of emotions, the practicalities of my predicament loomed ominously. The 3 remaining months on the lease for the apartment Christie and I had once called home presented a formidable financial hurdle. Pondering over my options, I found myself at a crossroads, torn between shouldering the burden of the lease or seeking an alternative course of action. Our joint assets amounted to little more than our cars, each with accompanying payments, rendering them a neutral factor in the equation. Our bank account balance was modest, and the furniture we owned held scant sentimental value to me, making it an easy sacrifice if needed. Reluctant to entangle our friends in the web of our personal strife, I hesitated to seek their assistance. However, the unwavering support of Chris and Heinz, long-standing companions from years gone by, proved to be an anchor in the tumultuous sea. Their spouses, Liz and Kim, echoed their offer of aid through a flurry of messages, urging prudence and caution in the face of chaos. Chris, in particular, extended a helping hand, pledging support in any form it may take. Accepting their gracious offer of refuge, I relocated to the guest room in Chris and Liz's abode. Liz, ever the voice of reason, underscored the importance of maintaining civility in my interactions with Christy, urging acknowledgement of her misstep while downplaying its gravity. Sensing the wisdom in her counsel, I assented to her conditions, recognizing the imperative of maintaining a semblance of harmony amidst the discord. In the ensuing days, I sought solace in the routine of work, albeit punctuated by prolonged hours to compensate for the morning's respite. Immersing myself in tasks served as a welcome distraction from the maelstrom of emotions swirling within. Arriving at Chris and Liz's home late one evening, weary and fatigued, I yearned for nothing more than respite and solitude, only to be confronted unexpectedly by Christy. Her presence, a stark reminder of the shattered remnants of our once shared life, stirred a tumult of conflicting emotions within me. Reminding her of my desire for solitude when I departed, I was met with contrition and remorse. She confessed to experiencing profound anguish in my absence, expressing a desperate longing for reconciliation. Despite the sincerity of her entreaties, I remained resolute in my decision. While acknowledging the depth of her remorse, I reiterated the necessity of space to navigate the labyrinthine corridors of my emotions. Her pleas for forgiveness reverberated in the silence, underscoring the complexity and fragility of our fractured relationship. I requested Christy to leave so I could have some space to process everything. With a heavy heart, she complied, exiting with a somber demeanor after a brief exchange with Liz in the kitchen. Meanwhile, I remained in the living room, grappling with the whirlwind of emotions raging within me. As Christy departed, she paused at the door to utter those three words, "I love you," before disappearing from sight. My resolve wavered, and I collapsed onto the couch, feeling utterly drained. Beside me, Liz offered her support, her presence a comforting reassurance amidst the chaos. Chris stood nearby, a silent sentinel in the hallway, his concern palpable yet unspoken. In the ensuing conversation, Liz commended me for handling the situation with grace, acknowledging the immense difficulty of the circumstances. Expressing my frustration, I voiced my belief that I didn't deserve such betrayal. Liz echoed my sentiments, emphasizing that I shouldn't have to endure such pain, regardless of Christy's culpability. Delving deeper into the heart of the matter, I sought insight into Christy's motivations. Liz revealed Christy's admission of succumbing to the allure of an encounter with someone well-endowed, citing it as the impetus behind her actions. However, she reassured me that Christy hadn't anticipated the repercussions, particularly my reaction and subsequent departure. Her revelation stirred a storm of conflicting emotions within me. Was the affair truly as inconsequential as Christy claimed? I demanded honesty, craving a raw and unfiltered assessment of the situation. Liz's response was a bittersweet revelation, confirming the satisfaction Christy had derived from the encounter yet asserting her unwavering commitment to our relationship. However, her actions spoke louder than her words, leaving me grappling with the bitter reality of her betrayal. Despite Christy's plea for forgiveness and reconciliation, I found myself standing at the precipice of an unbridgeable chasm. Her deliberate actions, the calculated manner in which she left in front of me and orchestrated my restraint to facilitate her escape, were etched into my memory with searing clarity. The subsequent attempt to seek my approval, to trivialize the gravity of her actions, only served to deepen the chasm between us. In that moment of clarity, I realized that forgiveness, though noble, could not erase the scars of betrayal. The trust that once formed the bedrock of our relationship lay shattered, irreparable. As I grappled with the weight of my decision, I knew that there could be no turning back, no reconciliation in the wake of such profound betrayal. Christy's repeated disregard for my feelings and the subsequent fallout left me grappling with a myriad of emotions and questions. Despite her claims of momentary lapse in judgment, I couldn't shake the feeling that her actions were not merely impulsive but reflective of deeper issues within our relationship. As I confided in Liz, expressing my frustrations and doubts, she attempted to provide solace, citing past instances of youthful indiscretions and the potential for reconciliation. While I appreciated her support and understanding, I couldn't help but feel a sense of disillusionment and betrayal. The disparity between Liz's optimism for our future and my own apprehensions was stark. While a part of me longed for the return of the happiness we once shared, I couldn't ignore the lingering doubts and uncertainties that clouded my mind. How could I trust Chris not to repeat her mistakes? Would our relationship ever regain the sense of security and trust it once held? These questions gnawed at me, overshadowing any glimmer of hope for reconciliation. As Chris made earnest attempts to mend the rift between us, I found myself grappling with conflicting emotions. On one hand, her apologies and gestures of remorse tugged at my heartstrings, reminding me of the love we once shared. On the other hand, the pain and betrayal I felt ran deep, casting a shadow over any possibility of reconciliation. Our shared dreams and aspirations, once a source of joy and inspiration, now served as painful reminders of what we had lost. The divorce proceedings, while necessary, marked the end of an era, the end of the dreams, plans, and hopes we had once shared. Despite the emotional turmoil, I remained resolute in my decision to move forward, to sever the ties that bound us together. Yet, even as I navigated the tumultuous waters of divorce, a part of me couldn't help but mourn the loss of what could have been. Following the finalization of the divorce, Chris sought one last conversation, free from any conditions. Reluctantly, I agreed, bracing myself for the inevitable confrontation. In a private meeting, she expressed remorse for her actions, acknowledging the irreversible damage they had inflicted on our relationship. Her words carried the weight of genuine regret, yet I couldn't find solace in her apologies. In response, I voiced my own regrets, lamenting the day our paths had crossed and the choices we had made. Despite the pain and heartache, I remained resolute in my decision to move forward, to forge a new path for myself. As we parted ways, I couldn't help but feel a profound sense of sadness, mourning not just the end of our relationship but also the loss of the dreams and aspirations we had once shared. Leaving the room was a symbolic act, signifying the end of any further communication or physical contact between us. In a strange way, it felt liberating, as if a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. However, it wasn't until 3 months later that I mustered the courage to step out again. Initially, my forays into the outside world weren't aimed at finding companionship, rather, they were a means of escaping the suffocating confines of my home. I found myself joining Chris, Hines, Liz, and Kim for outings, where their subtle attempts at matchmaking revealed their concern for my well-being. While I appreciated their efforts, I wasn't emotionally prepared for a serious relationship. Despite this, I allowed myself to engage in social interactions, enjoying the freedom of carefree fun without the burden of expectations. Although the people I met were amicable, there was no romantic connection, and our interactions dissolved with the dawn of each new day. Seeking solace in solitude, I began frequenting the club alone. It provided a sanctuary where I could immerse myself in the vibrant atmosphere without the weight of responsibility. It was during these solitary excursions that I reconnected with Tasha, a bartender whom I vaguely remembered from high school. Our interactions evolved from casual acquaintance to the tentative beginnings of a friendship, tinged with the possibility of something more. Almost 10 months had passed since Christie's departure with those men when I unexpectedly encountered them again at the club. As they lounged, casually sipping their drinks and surveying the crowd, an uneasy feeling settled in the pit of my stomach. Tasha, noticing my interest in them, probed about my curiosity regarding Desmond and Richard, revealing that they were regular patrons at the establishment. Intrigued by her insight, I engaged in conversation, delving deeper into their background and habits. Despite my initial assumption that they were out-of-towners, Tasha enlightened me, disclosing that they were locals who frequented the bar in search of female companionship, with Richard's well-endowed status becoming a topic of gossip among the patrons. Tasha's revelation about the bar being a hotbed for pick-ups sent a jolt through me, a stark contrast to her nonchalant demeanor. It was as if she was oblivious to the gravity of what she was sharing. With a furrowed brow, I probed further, asking about the demographic of women frequenting the establishment. Tasha's response was matter-of-fact, confirming the presence of single women, albeit mostly in groups. However, it was her casual mention of the men's preference for married women that truly rattled me. Suppressing the rising tide of anger within me, I voiced my concern about the inherent risks and moral implications of such pursuits. Yet, Tasha remained unperturbed, even nonchalant, dismissing my worries with reassurances that the husbands typically remained blissfully unaware. According to her, the men were discreet, and the wives complicit in their silence. In her eyes, it was a harmless indulgence, one that might even benefit the husbands in the form of extra affection. As I absorbed her words, a disheartening realization washed over me. If Tasha was so cavalier about the situation, then it stood to reason that she herself might not hesitate to partake in such affairs. Her recounting of a past incident, where the men's advances had nearly escalated into violence in the presence of a woman's husband, only served to underline the consequences of their actions. But it was Tasha's bombshell revelation about Christie's involvement in an affair that truly floored me. Suddenly, the pieces of the puzzle fell into place for her, and she was visibly taken aback, her shock palpable as she grappled with the weight of her words. Sensing the need to distance myself from the conversation, I excused myself and stepped outside, where I hastily dialed a number to set my plans in motion. In that moment, a surge of emotions coursed through me: betrayal, anger, and an overwhelming desire for retribution. Learning that Christie's involvement may have been part of a calculated scheme only fueled my resolve. While she may have willingly walked into their trap, believing them to be fleeting acquaintances seeking a momentary thrill, it did little to assuage the sense of betrayal and hurt gnawing at me. I observed their car in the parking lot, a gaudy Cadillac with its lowered suspension and flashy chrome rims, immediately drawing attention. It embodied a stereotype I couldn't help but recognize, and as I leaned against the driver's side door, I couldn't shake the feeling of déjà vu. Anticipating their eventual exit from the club, I braced myself for the encounter. It seemed to take an eternity, but finally, they emerged, accompanied by a woman they had no doubt charmed inside. I watched silently, my heart heavy with a mix of emotions, as they approached. Desmond, their apparent spokesman, breaking the silence with a casual "Hey man." Ignoring his greeting, I focused my attention on their slightly intoxicated companion, torn between sympathy and frustration. Despite any reservations I harbored about her choices, I couldn't bear the thought of harm coming to a woman, especially one whose husband likely remained oblivious to her actions. Addressing her directly, I couldn't help but inject a note of urgency into my tone. I urged her to reconsider her actions, to return home to her husband, the man she had vowed to forsake all others for. Her hesitation hung heavy in the air, a silent plea for guidance before she acquiesced, retreating back into the club, much to the displeasure of Desmond and Richard. As the woman disappeared from sight, the men turned their annoyance towards me, questioning my interference with their plans. I stood my ground, calmly reminding them of the sanctity of marriage and the responsibility they bore in respecting that bond. Recognition flickered across one of the men's faces, a distant memory surfacing from nearly 10 months ago. They inquired about her whereabouts, a glimmer of hope igniting in their eyes for another rendezvous. I delivered the news that she had moved on since then, leaving them with no chance of a repeat performance. Their demeanor shifted, their focus now solely on me, oblivious to the approaching presence of my friends. Before they could react, they found themselves restrained, outnumbered by my companions who had swiftly come to my aid. Despite their protests and struggles, they were overpowered, forced to kneel with their arms bound behind their backs. In a feeble attempt to justify their actions, one of them argued that they had merely made an offer and the woman had willingly accepted. I scoffed at their feeble excuses, redirecting the blame towards them and others like them who preyed on vulnerability for their own selfish gains, posing a threat to the sanctity of relationships and the fabric of society. I was steadfast in my determination to ensure that they would never repeat such reprehensible actions. Instructing my friends to carefully load them into Jed's pickup truck, We took precautions to secure the two individuals, anticipating any potential attempts to escape. Approximately an hour later, guided by Jed, whose family owned a nearby farm, we arrived at a secluded area deep in the county, far removed from any signs of civilization. Hidden amidst a sprawling grove of trees, miles away from prying eyes, we unloaded the men from the truck, their faces betraying a mixture of fear and apprehension. It was a stark reminder of the unforeseen consequences that they now faced due to their reckless pursuit of fleeting pleasures, echoing the fate that had befallen Christie. With a demeanor that veiled my underlying seriousness, I began to ponder aloud the most fitting course of action to address their predatory behavior. Deliberating on various approaches, I floated the idea of castration followed by their release, a suggestion that elicited visceral horror from the men. I highlighted the potential complications they would face should they seek medical attention afterward, a point on which they unanimously agreed, albeit with varying degrees of reluctance, as evidenced by the silence of my friends Desmond and Richard. Another option I put forth was the notion of taking their lives to eliminate any potential witnesses, a proposition that stirred a range of reactions: despair from Desmond and a morbid acceptance from Richard, who seemed resigned to the notion that death might be preferable to a life stripped of his manhood. Amidst the gravity of the situation, I took a moment to emphasize the folly of tying one's sense of self-worth to the physical attributes of their anatomy, pushing back against Desmond's feeble attempts to justify their actions as mere acts of love-making. My frustration simmered beneath the surface as I confronted these men, who brazenly believed they could seduce married women without repercussion. It was clear to me that it was time for them to learn a sobering lesson, to serve as a cautionary tale to others who might harbor similar intentions. Gathering the rest of our group into a private huddle nearby, our collective intention was to assertively convey the severity of their transgressions. Despite the temptation to respond with violence, I remained resolute in my commitment to confronting the offenders in a manner that would leave an indelible impression. It was not vengeance that drove me, but rather a firm resolve to ensure that justice was served and that they understood the profound impact of their actions. My true intention wasn't to permanently harm them. We kept them on edge for about an hour, leading them to believe we were reconsidering taking drastic measures. By the time we returned, their fight had seemed to drain away. I informed them that my friends had persuaded me against resorting to extreme actions and instead outlined the consequences they would face: a severe beating. While we assured each other of solidarity, I warned them that any police inquiries would lead back to them. I made it clear that we would closely monitor them, having obtained their addresses and workplaces from their driver's licenses. I issued a stern warning that any future targeting of married women would result in severe consequences. Desmond inquired if there was a way to avoid the beating, to which I proposed an alternative: they could escape punishment by performing a specific act. Desmond eagerly agreed, hoping to avoid the ordeal. With 10 of us, we vented some frustration on them, ensuring to avoid anything fatal. While there were broken bones, we avoided causing any life-threatening injuries. At the very least, they'll remember this for a long time. We dropped them off near a hospital, bypassing security cameras, and made headlines the next morning as two assault victims. The cases went cold, with the guys claiming they didn't recognize their attackers. A year after that dreadful night, I managed not to become entirely distrustful of all women, though it hasn't been easy. Word has it that Christie recently met someone, and Desmond and Richard have seemingly vanished. They're no longer working at the warehouse, and their apartments are empty. I suppose they're running their scheme in another city. Sometimes I wonder if I should have dealt with those two creeps more decisively. It crosses my mind often, and I occasionally regret the choice I made. Eventually, I had to find a new hangout spot as Tasha became more forward. My polite refusals didn't dissuade her, so I had to be blunt. I told her that nothing would happen between us. Since she saw nothing wrong with infidelity, I simply didn't believe her. I'd rather get 2 dogs than date her. I haven't made any plans yet, but I'll eventually start dating again.